Hey folks, this is JR with DIY Prepper. Welcome to the channel. When most people think of disasters, especially something like a long-term collapse, they usually think of outside threats. Maybe it's what caused the situation itself, like a major storm or an invading army. And then when it comes to threats from other people, their minds usually go to just faceless marauders roving around the countryside, taking out anybody who gets in their way. But the sad truth is that some of the most dangerous threats could actually come from the people around us. Now, I'm not saying that we need to be paranoid and closed off because that's going to cause its own problems. But we do need to take a close look at the people around us and try to figure out who could be a tremendous help and then who could cause us some very serious problems. The first kind of person that preppers should avoid is someone who is always looking for a fight. Now, that isn't to say that you don't want people around you that can fight if necessary, because you do. Sooner or later, you may find yourself in a situation where fighting is your only chance of survival, and if that happens, you don't want to be the only one around with the mindset and skills needed to do that. But the big problem with someone who's always looking for a fight is that they'll probably find one and you could get dragged into it. These could be people with chips on their shoulder who are constantly angry and looking for an excuse to go off on someone. It could also be somebody with a macho problem who's desperate for everybody to know how big and bad they are. Then on the total opposite end of the spectrum, pacifists are another kind of person that preppers should avoid. While you don't want to be around people who are volatile and unpredictable, you also don't want to surround yourselves with people who won't take a stand. While pacifism may seem more kind and evolved, many times those who claim to be pacifists are really just afraid to get their hands dirty. While they claim that they would never hurt a fly, I can guarantee you that if somebody breaks in their house in the middle of the night, they are going to call 911 and desperately wait for someone to come and fight on their behalf. So that means that if you're around a pacifist and something goes down, they're probably not going to have your back. So in a survival situation and also everyday life, it's best to be around even-keeled people who can strike a balance between being a fighter and wanting to live in peace. Because there's a big spectrum between people who are totally unhinged, folks that just want to live in peace, and those who are completely harmless. Because if somebody's peaceful, they may still have the willingness and the ability to act, but somebody who's harmless is just that. Another kind of person that preppers should avoid is someone who actually wants society to totally collapse. While most of us would agree that there are things that we'd like to change about our country and the world as a whole, having a desire to see everything fall apart and the devastation that would go along with it isn't really healthy. But when you meet somebody who wants some sort of long-term disaster to happen, many times they feel that way because they're miserable in their current lives and they see the end of the world as a way to escape that. And if you're dealing with somebody with that level of negativity, chances are that their mood won't improve much after they lose access to air conditioning, fast food, and toilet paper. Then also, if they're that miserable but still won't take the initiative needed to fix their situation, or at least try to, then they're probably not somebody you can depend on. Then another side to this is people who just hate other people in general. And y'all, there is a big difference between being selective in the people that you choose to associate with and just generally wanting the world to burn. And while I would suspect there's probably fewer in this group than there is in the other one, the folks who really just want to see that devastation just because they despise other people, I would imagine would probably be more dangerous since they don't really have respect for human life to begin with. Another kind of person that would cause preppers serious problems is anyone who is duplicitous. And that's just a fancy way of saying that somebody's a habitual liar, fake, or just generally treacherous. Sometimes these people act like they're the nicest person that you ever met, but they have a really bad habit of stabbing people in the back. Chances are you've come across several people like this in the workplace. It could be somebody that you thought you got along with great, then you find out they're lying about you just for the sake of office gossip, or maybe they did or said something that caused you to miss out on a promotion or get fired. And I think that these could be some of the most dangerous people during a long-term collapse because they'll always serve their own best interest. And since they're so used to lying, sometimes just for the fun of it, they're well practiced and would probably be difficult to spot. The next person that preppers should avoid is your typical loudmouth, and it's very important to identify people like this and avoid letting them know about your preps at all costs, because if they know, so will everyone else once things start to go down. I've had a couple of neighbors like this, and y'all probably have too, but none of them are as bad as the guy who lives down at the end of the road. The day we were moving into this house, we were still unloading furniture off of the trailer. This guy walks over and proceeds to air out the dirty laundry of everybody else living on the road. I don't know if he was trying to be welcoming or be seen as a good source of information, but to me he just came across as somebody I should never say a word to, period. People like this also want to find new things to talk about, so don't be surprised if they're watching you when you're out in your yard, or take notice if you add certain things to your home. One thing I thought was funny is that the same guy that I was just talking about, when I put up a doorbell camera, you know, like probably 40% of the American population nowadays, he went around the neighborhood telling people that I was watching everybody, which is hilarious because that's precisely what he does. But when dealing with people like this, be very careful what you say to them, what you let them see, and the same goes for anybody else who talks to that person. Another kind of person that could get preppers killed during a disaster is someone with a defeatist personality. These are the kind of folks that can find the negative in pretty much everything and always have a reason why ideas or plans won't work out. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't be realistic and practical in your thinking, because you absolutely should be. You don't want to live in a fantasy world where every stupid idea is the best thing ever, but at the same time, you don't want to be around somebody who lacks a survival mindset. Because if somebody's convinced that they aren't going to make it, or they've established red lines in their mind, like if this happens, I'm not going to make it, or I don't want to live anymore if this thing happens, then chances are those things are going to eventually take place, sort of as a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that means you'll probably be the one giving them a pep talk every 3 minutes, which is a lot to keep up with, and you probably won't be able to depend on them to complete certain tasks well, because they're just going to think it's pointless anyway. The next kind of person that preppers should avoid is two-dimensional thinkers. While they may seem similar to a defeatist, they're a little bit different because their main pitfall involves a complete lack of critical or creative thinking skills, and in a survival situation, you're gonna need both of those. Resources will probably be scarce, so many times you'll have to repurpose items for different tasks. You'll also have to think of solutions to problems you probably haven't even thought of, and people who can't see beyond just the obvious won't be able to do that. Then preppers should also avoid anyone who is overly insecure, because the main problem with people like this is that they cannot handle being around anyone who they perceive as more capable than themselves. And this is another person that you've probably encountered in the workplace. If someone shows up who's better at their job than they are, or even close to being as good as they are, they'll see that person as a threat, and this would be a big problem in a survival situation for a couple of reasons. First, since they can't handle people that they see as equals or greater, they're going to try to drive those people away, which will ultimately end up being detrimental to them and their group, since they're going to be losing out on a lot of higher level skills and ideas. Then second, if somebody's really insecure, then they may end up acting violently to ensure that they remain on top. The other person may not even be gunning for them, may not even realize that there's a problem, but it won't matter because a really insecure person won't be able to see anything but their own perspective. Then there's also the more obvious people that preppers should avoid, the first one being the mentally ill. And when it comes to that, there's a whole lot of different levels to it, but really what I'm talking about here are people with severe disorders like borderline or bipolar disorder that require medications in order to function properly. Because in a survival situation, those medications are only going to last so long, and then once they're off of them, their behavior could spiral very quickly, and if the condition's bad enough, it could result in violence against others. Addicts are another group of people who commonly end up in these kinds of lists, and what makes them so dangerous is that if it's severe enough, they might do pretty much anything to get what they need. That could be theft, harming others, or even turning on you to get into the good graces of somebody who has whatever it is they're after. And depending on what it is, it could also make them ineffective at the worst possible moment, because the last thing that you want is a habitual drunk covering you with a rifle when you're having to move from cover to cover. Another group of folks that usually end up in a list like this is criminals. Now, there's a lot of people out there that did something stupid when they were younger and they've since made a complete turnaround, and it's like that other thing never even happened. So I'm not really talking about those kinds of people. Who I am talking about, though, is individuals who are consistently in trouble with the law or have a consistent history of violent behavior. People who consistently engage in criminal behavior have already shown that they're willing to do unethical and sometimes violent things to get what they want, and you don't want to be on the receiving end of that. If you ever saw the show Falling Skies, you might remember the character John Pope. Back before all the aliens showed up, he was basically a career criminal, and even though he did a lot of useful things for the group through the duration of the show, eventually his true colors did show and he proved to be a liability. And really, it doesn't even have to be someone with a criminal record. Maybe it's just someone who doesn't have a moral center. This could be somebody who has a reputation for doing whatever they want without any real consideration for how it affects others. Like maybe it could be an upstanding business person who is well known for doing shady business deals. Because remember, when dealing with people, criminals or not, the best way to predict their future behavior is to look at things that they've done in the past. The next group that you commonly see in these lists is the government, and this is a fun one. Without delving into the darker side of things, you have to remember that in a disaster, governments have two primary functions. The first one is just to preserve itself, and then the second one is to maintain law and order on a large scale, because that helps with the first goal. So the rights and well-beings of individuals won't be at the top of their list if things start to go sideways. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but don't sit around and wait on the government to save you, and also keep in mind that if you have resources, they could try to confiscate them. Fun times. Then the unprepared tend to end up on lists like these also. A good example of this would be a friend or neighbor who says something like, "Oh, if things go down, then I'll just come to your house because I know you're prepared." And many times they say that half jokingly, but it's only half jokingly. There's a good chance that if something goes down and it does last long enough, that you and your preps are probably going to be something that they're thinking about quite a bit. Now, if you're somebody who wants to make things like benevolence kits of like food and water that you can hand out to people, then that's fine. That's probably a good thing to do. But just keep in mind that if desperation combines with the entitled mentality that a lot of people have nowadays, and they think that for some reason they deserve your preps, then you could have some very serious problems. But if we're dealing with a long-term collapse, other people would just be one threat that you need to consider. So if you want to see what a long-term collapse would probably look like and how to prepare for it, then click here. Or if you want to see a list of 10 important preps everybody should have, then click here. Thank y'all for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.